Welcome to episode number 66 of Off the Shelf.
I'm losing my religion. I'm losing my religion. Light a match and watch it burn. To your heart I will return. No one could love me like
Thanks for joining us for part 3 of our interview with Eleisha Moreno, a deep dive into the inner workings of the Seven Thunders subsect of the Message. This episode concludes the discussion that Emily, Tim, and I had with Eleisha on the 8th of August, 2020.
Eleisha, I understand that Joseph Coleman got quite sick, and that when he did, somebody from Montreal came down to New York and made some very startling prophecies about Joseph Coleman. How did that develop, and what led for it all to come crashing down?
Okay, yes, this was really the end. So there was a young man from Montreal named William Branham, and he had started attending our international church conventions at some point in the 2000s. The first time he ever appeared, he was very noticeable in one of the church services because he was wearing this black shirt, but it had like flames coming up from the bottom. And it was, it was kind of radical dress for a church service. So like everybody knew who this guy was because, he was the fire shirt guy,
It wasn't a Blazers hockey jersey, was it?
But over the years, he would send in testimonies to Joseph Coleman, mostly concerning healing and some visions here and there. And in October of 2010, he had written in about an experience that he had seeing handwriting on the wall, having a vision of handwriting on the wall from Elohim. And it prophesied about Joseph Coleman's healing. And, he had been so sick for so many years. He was diabetic, he had spinal stenosis, he had heart issues. I mean, he was a very ill man, and he was aging. He was in his 80s. But, we were so engaged basically in pastor worship that any kind of prophecy related to his healing was sure to get us riled up and engaged. So throughout 2011, Brunel continued to share all these prophecies and visions and experiences with handwriting on the wall. And at some point, the prophecy became that Joseph Coleman was not only going to be healed, but he was physically going to be changed into a 21-year-old man with blue eyes and a full head of hair and size 10 shoes. Like, this is how detailed we're getting.
Wow. What line do I get in for that?
And, the idea was that when Abraham and Sarah conceived Isaac, it wasn't just that God had enabled them to conceive in their old age, but that God had physically transformed their bodies back to youthful bodies. And so that was the premise of this belief, that Joseph Coleman's body was going to be transformed and that he was going to be 21 years old again. So the way that we bought it was he was very, very strategic, Brunel. He would find out things about people in the church, people in the inspiration, even around the world. And he would call them up, or he would meet with them, and he would tell them these very, very personal things about their lives that they didn't think he could possibly know unless it had been revealed to him by God. And they would testify afterwards that he told them things about their lives with pinpoint accuracy. And this happened so many times that we all just really believed that this was what was happening. We started referring to him as God's seer. And he also, in addition to this, he was bullying us and terrifying us into belief, which we were used to, but he took it to another level. So he would pick a day that Joseph Coleman was supposed to be transformed. And when he wasn't transformed that day, he would tell us it was because of our unbelief and because of our doubt. And we were not doing enough to make sure that our pastor was healed. And unconfessed sin as well, which is where, my husband and I come into it is, not only was I like, oh my God, I could die, my sin could be exposed, but it was also this idea that I'm holding up my pastor's healing. And this was a man that I had been essentially taught to worship my entire life. So he would tell us that he knew if anybody was ever having any doubts. And so anything he said, the minute you thought like, oh, well, that doesn't really make sense, you would beat yourself up about it and just like try as hard as you could to get those thoughts out of your brain because you believed that he was going to know and that he could call you out for it. He would rebuke us for sleeping when the pastor could not sleep. He would rebuke us for eating when the pastor could not taste his food. He would rebuke us for not spending enough time in the message books or recordings. So the result of that is a congregation that is hungry and sleep deprived and neglecting their jobs because they are at work listening to messages. Wow. So, I mean, that it's a recipe for mind control. And he really did. He controlled all of us. So
at some point in time, this all came crashing down. What happened?
Yeah. At our International Church Convention in 2011, the deacons actually found him in his hotel room with cocaine.
Nice.
But even then, it didn't come out. We were all just so fearful of this person at that time, and our pastor deeply, deeply believed in his prophecies. And we were told all the time that, even though the pastor's at home and he's sick and he's not here, he knows everything that's going on. It got to the point that Julian basically abandoned his wife and children in Canada and moved into Joseph Coleman's house on Long Island. And he told the pastor that in order to have complete faith for his healing, he needed to stop taking all of his medication. And he did. He stopped taking all of his medication. He had some women from the church who would come into the home to care for him. And there was one doctor in the church. And so this was the only physician that was trusted to ever, take care of Joseph Coleman. So at one point, I believe it was in November of 2011, this doctor told the family and told one of the elders in the church, he has to go to the hospital. He will die. And he suggested that they could even be charged, the family could even be charged with elder abuse. Because it was, he wasn't in his right mind. He's not taking his medications. My dad saw Coleman a little bit before he died. My dad said that he had bed sores on his body the size of dinner plates.
Wow.
So this doctor said, you've got to call the paramedics. You've got to get him hospitalized. So the elder, Joseph Coleman, he called 911. Paramedics come, and Julian Brunel stood in the doorway, and he refused to let the paramedics in. And at that point, Coleman's family had to kick him out of the house and say, you're not going to do this to our father anymore. And so he disappeared into Canada, and Coleman died a couple months later in early January of 2012. And the really crazy thing was nobody was saying anything about what happened. My husband and I always tell this story because we got married that November, and, Julian was basically controlling everything. We went on our honeymoon, and we get back, and Julian's gone. Our pastor's in the hospital, and nobody is saying anything about what happened. And I first heard about it from my dad, and my dad finally kind of acknowledged, yeah, Julian was a fraud. But even after that, the messaging that was going out in the church, and even after the pastor died, the messaging was nothing went wrong. No mistakes were made. This was all a part of God's plan. Nobody is culpable. This went down the way it was supposed to go down.
Unbelievable.
So is this when Eleisha, you kind of understood that you were in a cult? Is this the triggering thing?
Yep, it was.
Wow.
It was.
So you were gone not that long afterwards.
Yep. In, I think it was March of 2012, we had to vote in a new pastor. We voted in a new pastor who then essentially performed a ceremony to turn over Julian Brunel's body to the devil, that his soul might be saved. And 2 weeks after that, I was out of there.
Wow. Unbelievable.
It's a lot of stuff to process.
It really, and Rod, it reminds me a lot of the very, very conservative Catholics. Now, Eleisha, excuse me, I'm a recovering Catholic on the 12-step program for recovering Catholics. But at any rate, they have a segment or a group of Catholicism, Opus Dei, and they're ultra conservatives. And there are ascetic Opus Dei that essentially wear cilices, which are basically devices that give you pain as you walk, because they want you to feel the same. They want you to suffer as Christ suffered as he walked to the cross. It sounds to me like this guy's whole thing was, you have to suffer as your pastor is suffering, right? Correct. I mean, and that's a lot for an assembly to carry. That's a huge burden.
Right, because what we were told was that in order to pray for him the way that he needed prayer, we needed to understand what the burden was that he had. So we needed to feel the same burden. Hence sleep deprivation, hunger, fasting,
Unbelievable. Goodness.
When you left, did that leave you with a lot of guilt?
You know what? I never really felt guilty, but I did feel stupid. For a while, I couldn't believe how I could have ever fallen for it. But it's really been my, all of my research and reading that has helped me to let go of that feeling and just realize that that's how cults work. They brainwash you. You can be a smart person. You can still be brainwashed. Again, I was third generation, and I never had a chance. Like, this is what I grew up with. I never knew anything different.
Yeah.
This was not just a part of my life. This was my entire life.
So you would have considered yourself, as an example, you would have considered yourself 100% bought in. You were totally devoted to the message as a way of life, as a belief system. I mean, that was it. You were in.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I feel like I had some doubts here and there. There were some, things that I always questioned. The fact that interracial marriage was forbidden, that was something that I always questioned. Especially when I was in college, I started to believe that God was much more loving than I had always been led to believe. So I became more sympathetic to, more accepting of things like homosexuality and abortion. But still, even with those feelings, I always told myself, well, I'm never going to leave. And these are things that don't affect me, my life. I can be loving and accepting of other people. This doesn't really affect the way that I live my life. So I thought I would never leave. I always towed the line, except for, when my husband and I were dating and fooling around. I was all in.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
And I would say the only other thing that I ever really questioned was sometimes the leadership. And it wasn't necessarily my pastor, just because he was really on a pedestal. But, some people in the ministry were so cruel, so harsh, so unloving that, they weren't the examples that they were supposed to be. And so I questioned them as individuals, but I never questioned my pastor. I never questioned my belief system. Nope.
Wow.
So, Eleisha, what's left of the Thunder's movement? I mean, this is seeing all of these false prophecies, everything comes crashing down, Joseph Coleman dies. This is where cognitive dissonance really kicks in. And for our listeners, if you haven't read the book When Prophecy Fails, which it's kind of the leading book on the issue of cognitive dissonance, people don't leave, which is bizarre. But prophecies can fail, they still believe. Mm-hmm. What's left of the Seven Thunders movement? There's still people in it, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So after the new pastor was voted in, the church had a massive split at that time. And so, locally, one of the factions I would say, stayed more true to Coleman's original message, and that's where his family ended up going. And I think the belief there was still that everything that happened was part of God's plan. Yes, Julian Brunel was a fraud, but, Joseph Coleman never erred. The largest group that my in-laws are still a part of, they're still in the Thunders. They still listen to Joseph Coleman's messages all the time, but there was a greater acknowledgement there that things went really wrong at the end, and also a greater acknowledgement that for some time at the end there, Coleman was really not in his right mind, that he was senile and dying and unwell. Then there's another much smaller group that really just ended up rejecting the Seven Thunders entirely, and they're sort of a more mainstream message church now. But as far as like the international following, they're still in the Thunders, still in the biggest group of believers that are still in charge of like the physical church buildings in New York and Pennsylvania now.
So your parents still in it?
My dad, he's still a hardcore believer, but he's not really connected with a church anymore. My dad's a bit of a scandal, actually. So again, he was the head elder in Pennsylvania for many years. He was in the ministry basically from the time he and my mom were married. But my mother passed away in 2011, kind of in the height of the Julian era. And a couple years later, after the church split up and everything, my dad in Pennsylvania, he didn't have a physical church location to go to anymore because he was associating more with a very small group in New York. And, I was married, my brother had moved out, he was very lonely, and he'd start spending time with neighbors and things. Well, he ended up dating a denominational, evangelical Christian woman, and that was a huge no-no, obviously. And not only that, but she was, my dad's in his 60s. She was a widow. She had a son. And my dad, as a minister, believed that he was only, if he was going to remarry, he could only remarry a virgin. But they did end up getting married. So that ended up distancing him even further from anybody that was still involved. So my dad still really believes, and even his wife is like, ooh, wow, okay. He still doesn't like when she cuts her hair and when she wears pants and when she wears makeup.
This is so interesting because we talked about this in a bit of it on our last series of podcasts. The New Testament is clear that the Old Covenant is obsolete. Right. But yet William Branham takes all this stuff from the Old Covenant into the New, which the New Testament says we're not supposed to do. Yeah. And this creates all sorts of problems. And in fact, this is one of the big issues theologically that I have with the message from a doctrinal standpoint is all of these things in the New Testament, which we're not supposed to do, they do. Mm-hmm. I mean, where does it say in the New Testament that a minister is supposed to marry a virgin? Not there. There's this reference to the Levitical priesthood, but, Like if you take that, well, according, New Testament believers, we're all priests and kings with God. And so, no, this just doesn't work. But they want us, the ministry kind of puts this on people because William Branham did. And they've got to say, well, he's a prophet. He has to be right. Well, he's not. He's wrong.
Yeah.
So my dad is, he's pretty disconnected, even though he's definitely still a believer. One of the biggest points of contention between him and his wife is that she was not baptized in the name of Jesus Christ. I know, I'm telling you, it's a scandal. But my in-laws are still very, very deeply involved in the main Seven Thunders church that's still around. It's actually my husband's first cousin once removed, who is the pastor currently, which is also a scandal because he's divorced.
Wow. So, it sounds like there's so many layers upon layers upon layers of things that are inconsistent with each other and inconsistent with scripture. And it sounds to me like what a weight to carry all of this and to try to make sense out of it. So you've obviously, are you still in contact with people who are other than your family members? Are you still in contact at all with people that are involved in the Seven Thunders?
Just marginally on Facebook. I don't talk, but I have one friend. She's been my best friend from the time I was a toddler. We're still in touch, but she's part of the group who just went more like mainstream message. So she's really the only person outside of family that I have any regular communication with. I'm really, really disconnected from almost everybody else.
Wow.
So how did they treat you when you left, Eleisha? For us, it's, again, I look at scripture, and the way people are supposed to know that a person is a Christian is because the love that we have for each other. And you don't get a gold star for loving people, because Jesus said, you have to love your enemies. You got to love everybody. So love is like the basis of Christianity. In fact, Paul says in Galatians 5:6, I think, the only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. So no love, you got zilch, nada, zero. So have people treated you with love when you left?
No, it was just radio silence.
So you're radioactive.
Right. Yeah. And you're right. The whole time I was in the church, we always looked at our pastor as, a Christ-like figure as far as the way that he loved people, and even when he was blasting people, just being really, really harsh, he'd always followed it up with, it's because I love you. It's because I love you. But I really never knew what love was, and I especially did not know how to love others until I left.
Wow. That's sad. Very sad.
So people, if I ever run into somebody, which I still do occasionally, if I run into somebody, people are civil, but nobody ever reached out to us after we left. Nobody wanted to know why we left. You're just gone. That's it.
Wow.
So we've talked then about how people have viewed you. And I know many times we hear that we just do this podcast or put out research or do research because we hate William Branham or we hate the people in the message. You're obviously on this podcast today, And so what is your view of people who are still in the movement, both in the inspiration and in the message as a whole? Do you hate them? Kind of what's your perspective and what's your feel?
I mean, absolutely not. I see most people as victims. My husband and I talk a lot too about just the way that we think about our parents, and how I can't even blame my parents for the way that I grew up, because, my dad was 4 or 5 years old when he got into it. It's their whole lives. It's all they know. So while I wish, that they could see that it's all garbage and nonsense, I realized that it's probably not going to happen, and so I'm just sort of disappointed that they will never have that experience of coming out of it. But yeah, I kind of have that view of that they really are victims, that they're taken advantage of. And like we said earlier, so many people's lives have been completely destroyed by some of the beliefs. There were women in the church who had abusive husbands, and they were counseled to stay with their husbands. And, that was a bit of a double standard, because Joseph Coleman's oldest daughter divorced her husband because he was abusive, while other women were counseled to stay with their abusive husbands. So, it's painful to think about people who stay in it and suffer.
Mm-hmm.
So Eleisha, I'm going to ask you one last question, and it relates to just exactly what you're talking about as it relates to the people that are still in the movement. And I understand that there are a lot of message denominations who severely criticize people in their assemblies if they listen to these podcasts, or if they go to websites and do research, or if they reach out to former message people. Do you have any confidence, or do you have any sort of a feeling for anybody within the Seven Thunders that are actually, I mean, you're incredibly brave for coming on the podcast and talking to us about it, and we really appreciate your time, and basically your story is hugely inspiring, that you have an opportunity. You're in a great relationship with your husband. It sounds like you guys are well clear of the beliefs, and everybody struggles for a while as they move out of the message. So I understand that. But do you have any confidence that anybody in the Thunder's inspiration, or anybody is going to listen to your testimony here, your podcast here, and they're actually going to be able to gain any strength from it, or potentially gain any courage to look any further? Is that something that you hope, or is that something that you think, yeah, it's probably not going to happen?
I don't know. Probably not. I feel like the only way anybody would even listen is so they could talk about it afterwards and criticize me. I really think that's the only reason anybody who's currently in it would listen, is to see how rogue I have gone, to see how many spirits are on me.
Sure.
I mean, I would hope that maybe there would be a young person out there who, is maybe kind of on the fence. I don't know. My biggest hope, I have an 11-year-old niece, and so my biggest hope is that someday, if my niece ever decides to leave, that my journey out will help to support her. That's my really is on her.
Sure.
And that is the reason that we're doing these podcasts. Although some people have said, in case you didn't know, Tim and Emily, that we are being paid by the Jesuits.
Nice. When do I get my check?
I mean, it's very bizarre. Someone sent me an email and said, "Oh yeah, I know you guys are being paid by the Jesuits," and I thought, "Wow, this is really, really bizarre."
Nice.
I wish I was getting paid for doing this instead of it costing me. It costs me money to do this. I pay for it out of my own pocket. It's not a lot of money, but I also it's cost me hundreds and hundreds of hours. And the only reason I do it is because I love the people who are in the message, still in the message. We have had thousands of people listen to these podcasts, and Eleisha, I can tell you that there are thousands of people that will hear your story. And so I want to thank you for having the courage to come on the podcast with us, to share your story with our listeners. I know it's not the easiest thing in the world to do, and I know our listeners all appreciate getting an inside look on something they didn't know anything about, which was the Seven Thunders inspiration. I didn't even know they called it that, the inspiration. So I do really want to thank you and appreciate the time that you've taken for our listeners, because we really, really do appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's really been a pleasure. And I always find talking about it so very therapeutic. So even though I haven't actually pursued therapy in 8 years, it's things like this that really go such a long way towards healing. So I really appreciate the opportunity.
Great. And thank you, Tim and Emily, as well, for being with us.
It's been good as always, Rod. Thanks.
And Eleisha, it's sure been great to meet you and to be able to talk to you. Thanks for sharing.
It's been great to.
That brings our discussion with Eleisha to a close. We are still in the process of lining up our guest for next month's podcast, but I know you won't want to miss it. If you have a question or comment, please feel free to go to our website at offtheshelf.life. There is a comment section at the bottom of every episode's webpage, or you're welcome to send an email to me at rod@offtheshelf.life. And always remember, God is not afraid of your questions. Have a great day, and thanks for listening.
Oh, I'm losing my religion. I'm losing my religion. I'm losing my religion. I'm losing my religion to find you. To find you, to find